various links to Judge Calabresi speaking and teaching, and then introduced me to Norman Silber. And so tonight is really thanks to Lou and the fact he still pays attention to us, even though he's living in Florida and far, far away. And I really can't say what an honor it is. There is such excitement about tonight, and I'm going to get out of the way and let the two of you get on with it.
And thank you very much, Lisa, and thanks to the Columbus citizens for making this all happen, and thanks to Lou Mangione, who I had not met until you contacted me. So he's really a silent but imposing person behind all of this. I had not met Guido before this project began. I had read his work, but a close friend of mine, and who was then the dean of the law school at Yale, Robert Post, brought us together. We had taught oral history together, and he seemed to think that I would be the right person. And we went to dinner at the Union League Club in New Haven, and we met each other, and Guido said, I want to do it. So we started this project more than 11 years ago. And I would go up to New Haven, where they kindly gave me an office and a studio, and we take interviews for 2 hours every Monday for more than 5 years. We traveled to Italy together. I visited him in his chambers. We went around to his home in Woodbridge. It was a great, great honor and experience for me. I must say that the project turned out to be more than I would have expected. Of course, it took longer than I would have expected. But it's an invented format. It's something that I came up with, which is unusual in oral history. Most oral histories are simply the autobiographical memoir of somebody, but I've always been dissatisfied with that. I've always thought that shortchanged the reader and it shortchanged the subject, because people like audiences want to know something about whether or not the speaker who's speaking is speaking truly, whether his memory is good, whether his ideas are contested by other people. And so part of the reason this project took as long as it did is because Guido and I worked very closely on every aspect of the book. He had the final word in his narrative, and I had the final word in my commentary. And so the book is a dialogue. It's a dialogue between Guido and me and the audience. And with that, we thought the best way to do this would be to give you some sense of the way in which this book works. And Guido is going to basically tell you a little bit about his narrative and some from one of the chapters. There are 35 chapters in the book. We picked one chapter, and that chapter is chapter 5. It's a chapter about New Haven and coming to New Haven. And the book has 4 parts. It's about his Italian heritage. It's about his growing up in New Haven. It's about the history of his family in Italy. It's about his life as a scholar, as a dean, and now as a judge. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. It's an extraordinarily interesting way of doing. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Way of doing things, because this was my memories, and I've got a pretty good memory. But whenever you are thinking about things long ago, some of it may be true, some of it is true, but not quite that way. And Norm and people did incredible research to find what was really the case. And sometimes he can say in his commentary, yeah, Guido got it right. Sometimes he'll be a little critical. At other times he'll say, well, it's right, but not quite. And let me give you an example before I said somewhere in it that we were very well off in Italy, and we arrived here without a penny, because it was against the law under penalty of death to bring any money out when we fled. He found that was not exactly right. It wasn't penalty of death, but it was the case with a couple of people who had been taking money out, were put in jail and didn't come out alive. You see, what I said, as a lawyer, wasn't right. It wasn't happened. And so there are things where, in effect, he strengthens what I say by saying it accurately. He also learned some things about me and our family that I didn't know. Now, he had originally suggested that I should read some of what it says, but I hate to read. I don't lecture by reading and so on. And so I thought what I would do, I make notes about the things he wanted me to read, and I'll just tell you essentially what it says without reading. So the first thing is, in 1940, we come to New Haven. We come to New Haven because we got out of Italy because somebody, a man in Italy, who was actually Natalia Ginsburg's father, had friends in New York and got them to give us, the friends, to give Yale a fellowship for my father, who was a cardiologist, so that he could come as a fellow to Yale. And that's how we get out, and we arrive in New Haven in 1940. At that point, we are brought around first, or met, by somebody named Arthur Geiger, who was an assistant professor of cardiology, one of the very few Jewish professors in Yale at that time. And let's remember that Yale at that time, Yale College, didn't have a Catholic or a Jewish full professor until 1946. And that the law school was different. The law school was different in the 19th century. The acting dean and senior member of faculty in the 1880s was Catholic. So, the law school was different. The medical school, not much. The dean was Jewish, but said as to admissions that there should be no more than 5 Jewish students, 2 Italian Catholics, and no blacks. That was the Yale of that time. So we arrive, and the real estate people start taking us around. And they start taking us to Worcester Square, which was the Italian section. And then they take us to Westville, which was the Jewish section, because of our Jewish ancestors. And then, because they see that we're a little bit different, they take us to Goat Hill, which was a certain part, which was Irish Catholic, for those who didn't quite fit in the other. And at that point, the Geiger comes and says, no, you live between Whitney Avenue and Orange Street, between Canard Park and Edward Street, because you're ethnically Yale. If you're working for Yale, that is where all the Yale juniors live. That's where they live now, but at that time, it meant that we were pretty much the only non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were living in that area. So we moved into a little wooden house, which was the old farmhouse in the area. It's quite a nice little house. At the time it was, what it was. And after the war, one of my cousins from Italy came to see it and said, well, it's very, we no longer were living there, but we showed it to him. Very nice house, but do these wooden houses really last? It was not in Italy. And there we were in this house, which had an ice box, and ice was delivered from the Hygienic Ice Company every day to it. Well, one of the things that used to happen in Yale of that time was when a new faculty member arrived, the wife, because they were all male, of an old faculty member would come and call on them, the wife of the new faculty member, for tea. And both fellows were considered faculty in that. And so one day, after I came back from school and was playing around, I saw that my mother was entertaining a very distinguished, the wife of a very distinguished professor, her name was Keller, Mrs. Keller. He was an art historian. His father was one of the early professors of sociology at Yale. And they were having tea. And Mrs. Keller said, my mother, how do you like America? And my mother, who had an English accent because her English was from her English government, very nice. And to make conversation. And at this point, Mrs. Keller says, and what do you think of the plumbing? I, as a little kid, already knew that what she was saying, don't you like the fact that you have indoor plumbing? My mother, of course, did not understand what the heck this person was saying. And she tried to figure it out and answered, well, it's rather primitive, of course. After all, what should one expect? From her point of view, we had gone to America. At least there weren't people shooting arrows. Because the way Italians of means lived was totally different. And I, who had been in school not long, understood what both of them meant immediately. And it's interesting because I never said anything to my mother about what the other one meant, because I think my mother would have been upset because she didn't want to say anything rude, but she was being, in a way, as provincial as Mrs. Keller in not really knowing what was going on.
How old were you then?
I was just 7. I was 6 when we landed. And by the way, when we landed, I knew 3 words of English: yes, no, and briefcase. I knew German and French because I had a German governess and a French governess, but I had not had an English, and so I had to learn English, which I did. And interesting, again, this isn't in that part, but when we first landed, we landed in New York, and the fellowship didn't begin until January. We landed in September, and my father thought we might as well starve in New York as New Haven because the New York exams, medical exams, had more reciprocity. Didn't have much, but had more reciprocity, and so he could take them here because we didn't know whether we'd end up in New Haven as we did ultimately, or in Oklahoma. So we were in New York until January, and then went to New Haven. My brother was old enough to go to public school. We landed on Saturday, Monday, we were in school. He was old enough to go be put in a class which was all of non-English speaking kids. And that was very lucky because there were German refugees, some people from France, Spanish, which of course we could talk to, and he learned to speak English perfectly. I was too young and got put back in kindergarten, which is a disaster. I was doing math to a 5th level grade, and I was put back in kindergarten. And I should have been in 2nd grade. And so my English was learned partly there and partly from my mother, which is why I still have a little accent. By January, we were in New Haven, and was back in my class, and all was well. Odd things about how you know and don't know about New Haven. One summer, shortly after we were there, we were to go to, my parents thought it would be good for us to go to camp. And everybody told us we should go to the YMCA camp. And this sounded fine, but my father was worried because it was a young men's Christian association. And he wondered whether the YMCA, because it had that in its name, was anti-Semitic. Because in Italy, one would not have called something that way. It just was a way of work. And so we had to inquire, and we were told, no, it was perfectly fine. Everybody was welcome, and there we were. And so we went. Now, as he will tell you, it may be more complicated than that. We were fiercely anti-fascist. that's why he was left. My father was first jailed and beaten in 1924. I've just seen something that somebody found about my grandfather in 1926, having been exiled from Ferrara, his city, because he was a powerful businessman, and his wife, my grandmother, was a great landowning family. He went back for funeral, was arrested, and I have the document from the prefect of Ferrara to the prefect of Florence, where they, not a bad exile, where they had gone to live, saying, this is a dangerous man, he talks too much, and he talks too well, and he has the means to do it, and he's terribly anti-fascist. That was what we were. By the way, I just learned today that the people in Florence, the prefect in Florence, said that my grandfather should be sent to a confine, to the border, essentially to a concentration camp because he was so dangerous. It didn't happen because in Rome they said no, and I'm sure it was because this being Italy, we had people in Rome who said no, let him be there. Again, silly story. My grandfather was a very large man, but he loved to walk. And when he was after this arrest, they put a policeman to guard him, to make sure he wouldn't cause trouble. Well, my grandfather loved to walk, and this policeman, after a while, said, please, I know you won't get into trouble. I can't walk that far. Just tell me where you've gone, and I'll make a report, and you won't get me into trouble. That's very good. One story about our anti-fascism, which relates, and I'm not sure how much it is in there, to something of Justice Scalia. When Justice Scalia came to visit the law school, we were talking about how judges are affected, maybe less by ideology than by their background. Things that happen in their life that affect, because background you can kind of deal with. I mean, ideology you can kind of deal with, but background is what is there. And he said, oh no, and I said, look about guns. Your attitude towards guns is very different from mine, and issues of guns can be difficult, legal things, and you're gonna look at it one way. As a kid, you, who were a quirky little guy, because he was, went to a military school in the subway carrying a gun. It made him feel good. You know? It made him feel good, and he had always loved guns for that reason. My experience with guns was in first grade in Italy. We wore uniforms. My brother was in third grade and was already asked to march around with guns. My brother thought that was wrong. How and why, I don't know whether he caught it from my parents, but he thought it was wrong. And so, when there was the funeral of some big fascist and they wanted all the school children to march, my brother with guns and me shortly after, my brother said, we won't go. And I said, how will we get out of it? He was the older brother, I always did like that. He said, we'll say that our uniforms are in the laundry and we don't have enough. Now that was nonsense because we were so rich, but we didn't know that. And so we stuck to it and we did not march. And I got my only failing grade in my life. That term's pagella says comportamento fascista, fascist behavior. One other thing, and then I'll turn things to you, is when we were here, before America got into war, my mother actually got a telegram of condolence from my father's family, and she was shocked because she didn't know that her father was sick. She didn't know that her father was sick because my grandfather had forbidden anybody from telling her that he had a terminal cancer. He was a doctor, he learned of it early, and he wouldn't tell anybody. He wouldn't let anybody tell her because he knew that she would have gotten on the first ship and gone back. My grandfather and my grandmother, my mother's parents, were opposed to our leaving, but once she was here, he knew that if she came back, she might get stuck, and that was that. And as Norm will tell you, that fact affected what I wrote in one opinion, which dealt with immigrants, refugees, who had gone back for family reasons, and whether they were telling the truth about being refugees and persecutors.
Okay, thank you.
So, thank you, Guido. I'm not as adept as Guido at extemporizing, so I'm going to read the actual portions from the book. The way in which the book is structured is such that after each chapter of his narration, which doesn't have my questions in it, we just edited out my questions, it's just Guido speaking. And after each chapter, I have commentaries, and my commentaries are intended, as Guido said, to track his narrative. So, so that chapter starts by saying a bit about New Haven and Italians. The first known Italian immigrant arrived in 1717. The first known Jewish immigrants to New Haven came in 1758. Irish immigrants who came as indentured servants first arrived in New Haven around 1754. Poles began to arrive in large numbers in 1880. Russians and other East European Jews tended to settle along Oak Street. A wave of Ukrainian immigrants settled in Fairhaven beginning in the 1890s. Poverty and unrest in Italy fostered a wave of Italian migration to America. I'm sure many people here know about this, commencing around 1880. By 1920, more than 4 million Italians had come to the United States, representing more than 10% of the nation's foreign-born population. The immigrants came mainly from southern Italy, from Calabria, Campania, Abruzzi, Molise, and Sicily. Roughly 2/3 were farm laborers without much experience in factory work. They found their way to New Haven by railroad or steamer, and they moved into the formerly Irish neighborhood around Worcester Square and on Hill Street, Congress Avenue, and Oak Street. By 1910, there were 13,000 Italians living in New Haven, a number which by 1930 had more than doubled. According to the 1940 census, Italians made up by far the largest foreign-born element of New Haven's population. The communities that had established themselves earlier were prone to characterizing Italians as invading, inferior, alien, and unabsorbable. An old newspaper quoted the residents of New Haven describing the Italians as dark-hued, the men with rings in their ears, and women with large bundles of bed clothing on their heads, with about 50 small children. Unlike blacks who were torn from their families and imported as slaves into the United States, most Italians came of their own volition, and the communities they formed no doubt were a source of strength for their participation in American life. With the passage of the National Origins Act in 1924, the door closed to Southern European immigrants. It has been argued that shutting out these immigrants hastened the absorption and acceptance of those who were already in the country, that without the steady influx of new immigrants reinforcing the stereotypes and traditions back home, Italians began to settle into a more traditionally white, English-speaking, and acting American lifestyle. The period between 1930 and 1960 was characterized by the second generation's obsession with American nonconformity, where that which was ethnic had its disadvantages. So that, in a way, was my effort to contextualize what we're talking about his family. With respect to what Guido said about social teas, more recent generations of readers have little familiarity with the female hospitality ritual of serving tea. This began as an English custom, and it spread to colonial America, where competent performance of the ritual became a gender-specific talent that was expected of upper-class women. The proper serving and drinking of tea was taught to young ladies with as much care as they devoted to their academic subjects. And it was a fundamental duty of the social elite. At elite schools and in elite society, the ritual Guido describes was a way not just to greet, it was a way to assess refinement. Those unfamiliar with rules and the rules of ceremony were marginalized. One scholar has written, and in fact, tea was an established ritual in upper class Italian families as well. So I'm sure Guido's mother was quite well accustomed to the ritual of serving tea. Guido also has talked about his experience with the YMCA. So here's a comment that I made about the YMCA and about his father's fear of proselytization. Notwithstanding assurances that were made to Guido's parents, the broad story of the YMCA youth programs between 1925 and 1970 is one of a largely successful effort by conservatives to keep the original evangelical mission intact in the face of decreased fundamentalist membership and the increasing secularization of society. Some chapters opened their doors broadly, and apparently the New Haven chapter was one of these, but conservative factions in the National Board of the YMCA viewed this change with great dismay. Even in the 1980s, the matter of purpose and membership in the YMCA was constantly a source of conflict in the board of directors of the YMCA. Many chapters retained their evangelical traditions, and in 1939, months before the Calabresis came to New Haven, the National Council of the YMCA adopted a formal purpose identifying the YMCA as, in its essential genius, and I'm quoting, a worldwide fellowship of men and boys united by a common loyalty to Jesus Christ for the purpose of building a Christian society. So Guido describes a secular ethos that was still decades away from national acceptance, and so I'm not so sure his father wasn't. So that's the comment about tea. Finally, well, it's not quite finally, in April of 1940, the Nazi troops began a blitzkrieg that overran Denmark, Belgium, Norway, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and swept into France, pitting the British and French troops against the English Channel, as you all know. On June 10th, Italy entered the war for the first time and invaded France, dealing a death blow. And on that day, FDR passionately inserted into a foreign policy address famous phrase, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of his neighbor. After June 10th of 1940, FDR would pursue an all-out aid program to the democracies in an unprecedented buildup of America's military preparedness. And this isn't in the book at this point, but it's pretty clear, it's pretty clear that anti-Italian sentiment in America became severe beginning around that point. So finally, let me just talk about Guido's statement about his mother wanting to go back to visit her father. And this is an entry that's titled Bianca's Impulse to Return to Fascist Italy to be with her dying father. Guido's empathy for this situation is reflected in a court decision that he joined, written by Gerald Lynch in Cohn against Holder, which is a 2010 decision. Judges Lynch, Calabresi, and Cabranes were on the panel. An immigration law judge denied asylum on the basis of the credibility of the mother. The mother claimed to have been mutilated, and she feared for the mutilation of her daughters. But the mother had nevertheless voluntarily returned to the Ivory Coast on some occasions. And the immigration judge felt that this was evidence that asylum would be inappropriate since she felt comfortable going back to the Ivory Coast. And Guido wrote, or excuse me, it was the court that stated, return trips may be relevant, but under various circumstances, a person very well might risk persecution, the court stated, agreeing with another court that the health conditions of family members and other major life events might drive a person to choose to take certain risks and return home while doing his best to mitigate them. And my whole effort in the book, at least one of the principal themes in the book, is that you can't understand Guido's current jurisprudence. You can't understand his work as a dean. You can't understand his scholarship without understanding his life in Italy and the indelible impact that his historical experience, his life experience has made. I want to read one more piece, which I think addresses something Guido has talked about a little bit earlier, which has to do with the attitude about refugees of his class, and also with this complicated religious history in Guido's family. So John Tedeschi is a professor at Wisconsin, who Guido knew very well. And
He is, by the way, one of the people on the front page of that. The two others on the front page of this there is my mother, my father, my aunt, my brother. I'm there with a stick, and the other are Guido Tedeschi, who calls himself John, and his younger brother, who were in New Haven at the time.
Guido has there's a place in his narrative in this chapter where he's talking about people in Italy and his family, and he's in the period before the war, and
until 1943.
Until 1943.
Until the Germans, until Italy surrendered, and I said that by and large, people in my family, people of means, managed all right, despite the racial laws. The racial laws were a problem and serious, but especially if you had converted Catholicism, as many had, because it was a matter of Jewish ethnicity, background, and so on. If you were kicked out of public schools, you went to Catholic schools, and you were welcome. And so I said that by and large, until 1943, until Italy surrendered and Germany moved in, these people lived as they had before, but reasonably well.
So I contacted John Tedeschi, who was living in Wisconsin, and he had some thoughts about that, and Guido stated that basically people were living okay. He observed that after the fall of 1938, neither Guido's father Massimo nor his sister Renata Calabresi could have been part of Italian academic life, and that even an independent professional career would have been difficult, if not impossible. Tedeschi also observed that for many Italian Jews who emigrated, the impending war and anti-fascism were often given as the motives for departures, and almost never the loss of their impending civil rights as Jews. In a classic study of Italian Jews in this period, Renzo De Felice, he wrote in a vein similar to Guido that notwithstanding the passage of the racial law, Jews of a certain social and cultural level managed to leave the country or to persist without great hardships or even to assist the fascists notwithstanding that persecution. He went further, though, to argue that this did not diminish, indeed it proved, the moral monstrosity of the persecution through the racial laws. A monstrosity, he wrote, that no tolerance and no humanity, no well-meaning help by the fascists will ever be able to mitigate. He observed that the financial damages to broken careers can be compensated, the wounds in time may heal. The bereavement for dead relatives can be soothed. What cannot be compensated, soothed, and repaired is the moral tragedy of those who felt Italian, who wanted to be and were Italian, and in a few weeks were denied of all this without any reason. So, in a way, I'm supporting what you said. I think my ultimate feeling here is, yes, Jews were basically okay, but, and you.
What you said about people who came, claiming always that they claimed for anti-fascism is interesting. It's especially interesting that John Tedeschi said so, because as he noted, his father had been a fascist. As many Italians and Italian Jews were. And one of the, we have found a letter from Salvini who asked my aunt, who fled shortly after us, about who was doing what, because Salvini, who had been the leader of the small group of anti-fascists that my father had then been, and had been taken over by the Rosselli, who Stan has written about, and who were very close friends of my father, said, among the people who have come, those who are saying now that they're anti-fascists, but really weren't, as against those who really were, and that's an interesting thing.
So that's the way the book's structured, and I hope you enjoy reading it. And it's got many, many parts. This is just one of them. Thank you all.
I'd like to make a couple of comments on his comment. Just because of the way it's structured.
Church has to have the last word.
And then have questions.
Military question.
First, we were in a very odd situation in New Haven because my parents, my mother especially, wanted to be very active in the Italian community, even though it was very different, and she did. And she had all sorts of things there, and ultimately she was made a cavaliere because of what she had done there. But one of the things that she had to do was to urge people to be Italian, because especially the ones who were most integrated didn't want to do things that Americans would think of as being Italian. So they didn't want to drink wine. It's good. It's fine. It's elegant. On the other hand, she was also the first person who was not Italian and the only one for many years to become a member of the Circolo Italiano, which was an Italian literature reading group started by Mrs. Whitney of the Whitney family of a cotton gin and so on, because she was sufficiently different from other Italians. And I've got to tell you, in a day when people talk about affirmative action, I got a lot of affirmative action because people were beginning to want to do things for Italian. Not everybody, with tremendous prejudice, but some people wanted to do things. and it was much easier to do things for me, because as I tell to my African American students, I was a Nigerian. That is, I came from Italy, and they could have me and include me when they didn't really want to include the people from Worcester Square, the people who were the Italian immigrants who were not. They could show off their openness. Finally, when he said about the war and the Italian thing, again, the world is very spread. When the war came, my mother, who was teaching at the State College, she typically taught different places, but was fired because she was not an American citizen, and so couldn't teach her. It was a great ruckus among the faculty and students, because we were not allowed to travel more than 75 miles because we were enemy aliens. We couldn't have cameras, and we couldn't have radios because we were enemy aliens. Not treated anywhere near as badly as Japanese American or even German Americans, but it was there. But here's the funny thing. At the same time that was going on, the FBI came to call many times on my father to ask him where they should land, what they should bomb, and so in Italy, because they knew of him as a very well-known, established anti-fascist, and so we would be there. But at the same time, interesting world.
Well,
Bravo!
Big success, and on top of it, you know, we hope you'll come back often. I mean, we didn't even scratch the surface, I'm sure. And we're gonna take questions, but I'm gonna take my executive director prerogative and ask the first one. So you had this long process. You produced 2 volumes. And so it's really a 2-part question. One, was there something absolutely certain you were gonna put in the book that got taken out in the end? And you must have had to make a lot of tough decisions. I mean, even though you have 2 volumes, you had to figure out how to balance a long, distinguished career, the Italian heritage, this very interesting story about how Italians were treated here and the perceptions. So, and a lot of subtleties. I mean, the YMCA story is fascinating because I think most of us, or at least I, didn't really understand that was the origin of the YMCA. So I'm curious how you handled over all those Mondays.
There are many things that are not in the book. The tapes
Can't put everything.
of all the things that I've said are going to be on file at Yale, and people will be able to research them and find all sorts of things that, as he took down my tapes, those I haven't seen because they're just my tapes of me talking, but they are there, and some of the comments you haven't made. He's the one who made the decisions. And that was very important to me. I said to my colleagues on the court and on my colleagues at the faculty, if you're not mentioned, it's not my fault.
That's quite right. That is quite right. You know, there are a lot of stories that had to come out, and there's only one representative story there. I'll give you one example. There was an admissions director for many years named Jack Tate. And Jack Tate was basically responsible for deciding in an era when there really weren't a lot of committees. There was basically Jack Tate who said, you're in or you're out. So imagine you're coming to Yale Law School, and you know, your life is changed, transformed by just somebody who happens to think that you have talent. And so there's a story in the book about a fellow who wasn't really thinking of applying to Yale Law School, and I'm a lark. The University of Pennsylvania was holding interviews, and he comes into this office, and there is this guy with a pipe in his mouth, and he's reading a book. And the kid notices that he's read the book, and they have a conversation about the book. And the guy with the pipe, Jack Tate, says, well, I don't see your application here. You didn't apply. He said, oh, I don't have a chance to get into to Yale? And he said, you're in, just. and you know, of course, so there are hundreds of people who not told me stories, but there were dozens of people who told me stories. And there are always these stories about this wonderful person named Jack Tate. Well, of course, I mean, if your genius was recognized and you ended up at Yale Law School,
He must have been a pretty smart guy.
yeah, he must have been, he recognized your brilliance. He recognized your brilliance and you got into Yale Law School. So, I mean, many of the stories in the book are exemplars of other stories. And I will tell you just another one that is in the book that represents a lot of stories about Guido's generosity and his unique character. And it involves a case that many of you may be familiar with. It's about Marty Tankleff, who was accused of murder and was ultimately exonerated. And it stuck with me because I interviewed him and Guido had told me the story. And it's representative, it's emblematic of Guido in many ways, but here is somebody who ended up through, it wasn't Guido's responsibility, but in some ways Guido was in remorse that he didn't do more. And this person had sat in jail for 17 years. 17 years. And when he got out, Guido, you asked to see him. And he came to New Haven and they had a relationship and they built a relationship. And it's still going on. He wrote you endorsed a character reference for him and he went to law school and he had families and they're together.
And he's now teaching at Georgetown,
And he's teaching
a member of the bar.
But that's a story, that's one story. So you asked me about things that, you know, there are a lot of stories that could have been in the book.
I could tell you 100 stories. And you know, all of them wonderful. I can't resist telling you one. By the way, his admissions fee, when I went on faculty, Harry Wellington and Robert Stevens were new on the faculty, and we said it's outrageous that somebody can just decide who comes in. It's not a process, it's not good. So the dean said, you're a committee to look into it. We looked into it and said, this is obviously outrageous. On the other hand, we saw what happened to all the people whom Jack had accepted and said, it's outrageous, but as long as he does it. you know, there are some people who had an eye in the stock market.
That's
He did it. I mean, Kellinger and Schmidt, any number of people, he just picked them. The story I want to tell you is of a kid who became a dean of a law school subsequently, and who's written about this. He was young and quite poor, and had gotten into Yale and into Harvard, and decided to come to Yale. And Yale University at the time had an outrageous rule that if you had a car, you could not have a scholarship, because they thought if you were going to spend money in the car, that was it. And this kid had a girlfriend who was studying near Cornell, who was now his wife, and he said, I have to have a car to go see her. If Yale, and I need a scholarship, so if Yale won't let me have a scholarship, I've got to go to Harvard. And he went to see Jack Tate and said, I'm withdrawing. This was summer before he started. And Tate said, describe this vehicle. Tate described a jalopy, and Tate said, I don't believe that qualifies as a car. He said he learned something about humanity, and he learned something about statutory interpretation.
Go ahead.
Why hasn't anybody written? You mentioned about prejudice.
I'm sorry?
Why hasn't anybody written a biography
Of Jack Tate? I don't know. You could get any number. I mean, this is a person who wrote the famous Tate letter when he was State Department. His portrait is in the law school because so many students have, but somebody really should go and interview many, many of the students who he brought in. I could tell you any number of stories you would expect to read where I was just acting stupid, and he guided me.
What I wanted to point out, and many of us here should know this, is that you mentioned prejudice many times, World War II. And yet, interestingly enough, the one singular identifiable group of young men who served in our country in World War II were young men of Italian heritage. And what's amazing is that these are many that just came over as young people or were just born here, so identified with being Americans that they went and they fought in Italy. Okay, so I don't know whether everyone in the country recognizes that, but for example, in recent times, are beginning to recognize the contributions of the men of African heritage who did serve, even though they were segregated, but yet they did serve and served admirably. So that's a fact. The question I have for you, judges, both of us go back a long time ago, although you do have a few years over me, and I think my beard has gotten bigger than yours, okay? My son, who's also a very author right now, has said, when he goes to court, and it's been wonderful for me to hear this. He said, where's your father? How old is your father? We love him. And like in the circuit court, they say, we miss your father. They don't make lawyers today the way they used to be back then. I wonder whether that is an accurate. We were fighters there. We really did the best. We studied. We argued before the circuit court or on trial. Have you found that to be accurate?
I can't say about lawyers a long time ago because, I've been a judge now a long time. I had never, and I'm 61, almost 62 when I became a judge, I had never set foot in a courtroom before I became a judge. It's quite extraordinary, an unusual thing. President Clinton decided he wanted me as a judge and just picked me from being dean and put me on court. The ABA, against their rules, said that I was well qualified, their top rank, even though the rules were that somebody who hadn't litigated should not be. It was fine. I can't tell you about lawyers in the past. I can tell you that lawyers now ain't very good.
Oh,
That's it.
Open it up, my son. So, I'd be interested to know, even though you certainly alluded to it from different angles, how you chose the title of the book, Outside In.
Should I guess I'm primarily responsible. As I sort of interviewed Guido, I sort of put together my own sense of a person whose family may have been in Italy, but they were certainly outsiders from the time that they came to the United States, really until the time the two kids, and I shouldn't forget saying that Guido had a brother who was almost equally successful in his own field of
He was the
medicine.
bright, interesting one in the family.
But they were paper boys, and they were really in New Haven marginalized. They were outsiders. And the whole first volume was originally going to be called Outside, and the second volume was going to be called In, because it's a story of somebody who basically comes inside, becomes, from external perspectives, the ultimate insider, although not in his own identity ever. He's never perceived himself as an insider, although objectively others looking at him would declare that he's certainly inside. So it was, and at some point, even late in the process, Guido said to me, he called me up and he said, Norman, I thought about this and we can't call one volume Outside and one volume In. It just doesn't fit. It's almost neat, but it doesn't quite work. So we then decided we would put dates on the volumes. We would say volume 1 is up until 1982, and volume 2 is 1982. And I gotta say, Guido, I don't think I've said this to you before, but originally I was gonna say 1982 to the present. And you said, no, what about a third volume?
Let me say something about that and how I spoke as often, and then he took and did something. I told him that after the war, my parents were uncertain about whether to go back or not. And my father, for some reason, on the whole, thought he would want to go back. My mother, though she felt the loss of her family there enormously, probably slightly more wanted to stay here, all very but they were quite undecided. And so it fell on my brother and in many ways. My brother went back and had the same experience that I had when I went back a couple of years later. We found ourselves in a situation where to be poor in Italy would have been terrible after the war, but to be wealthy and to be insiders, as we had been, was something we did not want. You know, we had been outsiders long enough so that that was who we were. And so we said we wanted to stay. And people laugh because they say there's nobody more inside now than somebody like you. And yet, I think if I am a decent judge, it is because I am still deeply an outsider.
Well, that is
And the book, my dedication to the book is to outsiders and those who help and I put my glasses on.
The dedication reads,
And dedication is to outsiders and to all those and to all who help and welcome.
And now that we know that there's going to be a third volume, we know we'll do that. And thank you everybody for coming, and for those of you who got your book signed, I think you know you have a real treasure that will not sit on the bookshelf. We're all going to go home and read this with great delight.
And we'll be up for 3 days.
Thank you so much.
thank you very much.